Welcome everybody to Options Trading, brought to you by Alpha Traders. We are going to have a quick look at derivatives. Now this is number 4 of 9 in this video series talking about options, getting people ready for options trading to understand what options actually are. So a quick look at derivatives. You may have heard the term before, but you never really understood what it meant. So now let's finally talk about what derivatives actually are. A derivative is a financial instrument which derives its value primarily from the value of another financial instrument. Now, if that sounds a little crazy to you, it basically means that a derivative is a contract. We'll talk about that in the next slide, but from that contract, it gets its value from something else. For example, let's say that we're trading wheat and we're trading wheat futures. The futures is actually considered a derivative because it derives its price from wheat as a value. So where wheat has an underlying value, the futures is now projecting that value into the future, where you would have a contract and then you would have an expiration on that particular asset, that asset, for the example, being wheat. So essentially, a derivative is a contract, like we just talked about. The contract itself is usually tied to an underlying asset, and the example we use would be wheat. There are some derivatives that are tied to a set of assets, and that would be something like an index. So where you have the S&P 500, then you have SPY, where a lot of people will trade options for SPY, which is considered a derivative. But then you can also have the ES1 and the ES minis, and these are futures based off the S&P 500. But again, based off the S&P 500, meaning these contracts are they're tied to an underlying asset. And that underlying asset would be the S&P 500, which is not one particular asset, but 500 different assets all wrapped together in an index. So in almost all cases, the value of the contract will change as the underlying asset's value changes. Now, in the example we talked about earlier when we said what's different between stocks and options and how we can have the underlying value of something go up, but the options actually go down, that would be a unique case or a unique scenario where not all the time the value of the contract go up if the value of the underlying asset would go up as well. Now, common derivatives, futures contracts, forward contracts, options, swaps, and warrants, these are all very common to the derivative market. Now, the markets for derivatives, as far as sectors are concerned, real estate, film and TV, lines of credit, bonds, mortgages, futures, and options. We're mostly concentrated on options. Down the road, maybe you'll talk a little bit more about futures, as there are a lot of similarities between options and futures. And we'll talk about one of the differences right now. When it comes to options, a very important difference between options and futures is that in options, the owner of the options contract has the right to exercise the option, but not the obligation to do so. That obligation to do so is where you'll find your futures market. So again, one very distinct difference between options and where it got its name from as opposed to futures is that options does give you that right to either exercise the option or not. And that's a very, very, very important difference between options and futures. All right, so that was a very quick look at derivatives. No reason to draw it all out, make it any more difficult than it already is. Pretty cut and dry. We'll be back on the next video where we're going to talk about a glossary of terms you'll need to know for options trading.